Elizabeth I had many suitors vying for her hand. However, of all the dukes, kings and princes who wanted to sit alongside her on the English throne and were turned away in shame, there was one gentleman of the court who never gave up on her, even if his affections would be forever unrequited. Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, otherwise known as My Boy Robin Dudley, was the son of a traitor and the possible lover of a queen. It's never been completely clear if their relationship was as intimate as many courtiers believe, but of all the loss and injustices Elizabeth I faced, Robin was always her one definite safety net in her turbulent life up until his death. For the second video in my Typecast Tudor series, it is time to explore the life of Robert Dudley. Robert Dudley was born on the 24th of June 1532. Knowing his date of birth explains a lot. He was a Cancer, Elizabeth was a Virgo. Can I make it any more obvious? Those are two very compatible zodiac signs. The Dudley family had become cemented early on in the Tudor court thanks to Robert's grandfather, Edmund Dudley, who became a member of Henry VII's Privy Council in 1492. He served as an MP and Speaker of the House of Commons, and would also be knighted for his services. However, immediately after the death of Henry VII, Sir Edmund Dudley was charged with treason. He was accused of assembling arms in anticipation of the king's death. It was treasonous to predict the king's death in any way, but the truth was he was made a scapegoat against Henry VII's more miserly financial decisions. He and Richard Empson had proved themselves quite unpopular by demanding protection money from merchants throughout London. Edmund wrote The Tree of Commonwealth while in prison, hoping it would convince the young Henry VIII to spare his life. The piece was an endorsement of absolute monarchy. Whether Henry read it or not was irrelevant, as Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson were both executed on Tower Hill on the 17th of August 1510. Though not a moral person, he was the first victim Henry VIII would have executed for his own means. Sir John Dudley was 5 or 6 years old when his father was executed, and he was raised in the household of Sir Edward Guildford. The Act of Attainder on the Dudley family was lifted in 1512. He began a military career aged 15, and later went on to serve Cardinal Wolsey. In 1523, the Duke of Suffolk, Charles Brandon, led an invasion party into France, which would ultimately come to nothing. Nonetheless, this was where John Dudley received his knighthood from Brandon. He continued to rise in influence, and by 1534 he was in charge of Henry VIII's armour. He had married his guardian's daughter, Jane Guildford, in 1525, and they had 13 children together. Robert was the 6th child, with Henry, Thomas, John, Ambrose and another Henry preceding him. After him came Guildford, Mary, Charles, Catherine, Temperance, Margaret and another Catherine. However, not all of his siblings survived childhood. Robert and his siblings were given an extensive education in the new Renaissance style. Roger Ascham and John Dee tutored them at some point. Ascham praised Robert for his talent with languages. The Dudley siblings were known for being close and loyal to one another, and they enjoyed many privileges while their father continued to serve at court in a military and diplomatic manner. He became the new Viscount Lisle in 1542 and given the title of Lord Admiral. He was in charge of the Battle of the Solent in 1545, when the French navy attempted to invade England. The English were victorious, but they suffered the loss of their most famous ship, the Mary Rose.
Milhouse, how could you let this happen? You were supposed to be the night watchman. I was watching. I saw the whole thing. First it started falling over, then it fell over.
While close to the king, he sided with the Seymour faction and favoured the Protestant religion. It isn't known when Robert and the Lady Elizabeth first met, but it was likely after the birth of Edward VI, where Robert was made one of the young prince's companions. By the time Henry VIII died in 1547, Robert and Elizabeth likely knew each other very well. Upon Henry VIII's death, which hardly came as a great surprise to anyone, Edward Seymour moved to claim the regency for himself. John Dudley received the earldom of Warwick, and he ceded the Lord Admiral title to Thomas Seymour, becoming Lord Great Chamberlain instead. He became the most valuable asset in terms of England's military might, and was often away fighting the rough wooing on the Scottish border. Robert, who was in his early to mid-teens at this point, continued to serve King Edward VI household, alongside his younger brother Guildford. In 1549, Warwick was sent to quell Kett's rebellion in Norfolk, and he brought his sons with him. It was here that Robert met Amy Robsart, who was the daughter of a gentleman farmer. Fortunately, by the time they were married in 1550, Warwick had usurped Seymour as Lord Protector. Warwick, now the Duke of Northumberland, encouraged Edward VI's anti-Catholic policies, much to the chagrin of the king's older sister, the Lady Mary. In 1553, Edward's health was beginning to deteriorate, and there was no alternative heir to replace him with. Elizabeth might have been a prospective candidate, but if they were going to discredit Mary by reinstating her illegitimacy, Elizabeth had to share the same fate. Instead, Northumberland altered Edward's will in favour of Lady Jane Grey, who had conveniently just been married to Robert's younger brother Guildford. As we know, Jane only ruled for 9 days before she was usurped by Mary. Robert was at King's Lynn at the time, which he was holding for his sister-in-law. The townspeople captured him and handed him over to Mary's forces, where he would be imprisoned in the dreaded Tower of London. By all rights, he could expect to follow his father Northumberland to the block. However, at the start of her reign, Mary I did not want to follow her father's example of hot and cold rolling heads. Northumberland was the only one she planned to condemn, and John Dudley was executed on Tower Hill on 22nd of August 1553. Robert was still in the Tower of London when Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger rebelled against the Crown in protest of Queen Mary's imminent marriage to King Philip II of Spain. Elizabeth, who was Protestant and next in line, was made the figurehead in the rebellion. Elizabeth was brought to the Tower of London while Lady Jane Grey and Guildford Dudley were executed. Elizabeth and Robert are typically believed to have grown closer while they were confined, though how close they could have been is a mystery, seeing as they were both under constant vigilance. And Mary would not have approved of her sister getting too close to her usurper's brother-in-law. Elizabeth left the Tower in 1554 for Woodstock Palace, while Robert and his brother Ambrose stayed until the autumn, and even took part in a tournament that December. It seemed that the surviving Dudley brothers were kept on a tight leash, and Robert was determined to keep his head down to avoid it being struck off. He was regularly at court or on military campaign. In August 1557, he saw his brother Henry killed in front of him by a cannonball. Mary, it seemed, was ready to forgive the Dudleys and remove the act of attainder on their family, restoring them to proper favour. Mary I herself despised the act of attainder and pardoned many who had suffered under it. On the 17th of November 1558, Queen Mary died. A contingent of male courtiers, including Robert Dudley, rode straight to Hatfield House, where they found the Lady Elizabeth walking under a tree in the park. There, they proclaimed her queen. From day one, Robert was Elizabeth's immovable favourite. She named him Master of Horse the same day she became queen. This was a prestigious role, as not only was he now a Privy Councillor, he would be in charge of the royal stables, as well as Elizabeth's personal transport. Such a role gave him great authority in arranging her coronation. The deep connection between the Queen and her horsemaster was noticed right away. In April 1559, he received the most prestigious honour of Knight of the Garter. It was a title that a courtier would sell their grandmothers for. Speculation grew that they were visiting each other's chambers at night, and foreign ambassadors wrote back to their masters, believing that Elizabeth had every intention of marrying him. That plan had but one flaw. Robert Dudley was still married. Amy Robsart was noticeably absent from court, and Robert was rarely seen apart from Elizabeth. He visited her a few times over the spring of 1559. By December of that year, she was living at Cumnor Hall, in what is now Oxfordshire. The borderlines changed. It is believed that she was dying from breast cancer, and Robert was leaving her to die so he could marry Elizabeth. Amy did live in comfort, however. She had the best rooms in the house, and she was allowed to use her family's money to keep herself. Robert sent her gifts, but it became very obvious to everyone at court that he would not leave Elizabeth's side to be with his ailing wife. Whatever ambitions Robert had on marrying Elizabeth were quashed irrevocably on the 8th of September 1560, when the servants at Cumnor House came back from a fair and discovered their mistress dead at the bottom of the stairs. Robert was at Windsor Castle at the time. Immediately, his enemy spread word that he had killed his wife to make room for the Queen. Elizabeth, to save herself from any scandal, sent Robert from court, while an inquest was held into Amy's death. Robert's steward concluded that Amy would not that day suffer one of her own sort to tarry at home, and was so earnest to have them gone to the fair, that with any of her own sort that made reason of tarrying at home, she was very angry. Certainly, my lord, as little while as I have been here, I have heard divers tales of her that maketh me judge her to be a strange woman of mind. Her maid, Miss Pictou, also believed that Amy was in some mental distress, noticing her regular praying for some kind of deliverance, but ruled out any possibility that she may have taken her own life. To this day it remains a mystery as to whether Amy was murdered, or if she fell by accident, or if she took her own life. To be honest, I think it would have been very foolish of Robert to have ordered his wife's murder in such a way that made him look guilty. If it was a murder, it seems more likely that it was arranged by one of his enemies who wanted to frame him. Elizabeth always appeared to plan too far ahead to have wanted Amy murdered if there was any chance it might be traced back to her. Amy may have taken her own life, and her method of making sure all the servants were gone was either her way of testing to see if anyone might stay and potentially stop her, or if she wanted to make sure that she wouldn't be stopped. Out of heartbreak, she may have wanted to spite Robert by dying now, rather than going through a slow, painful death, only for her husband to potentially marry Elizabeth afterwards. And yet it all could have been a coincidence. An impartial inquiry ruled that Amy's death was an accident. Robert returned to court after he was cleared of murder, and resumed his position as Elizabeth's favourite. In October 1562, she contracted smallpox. She named Robert to be protector of the realm should she die. Fortunately, she survived, but afterwards she stated that she was the Virgin Queen, married to England, one mistress and no master. Meanwhile, the other monarch of the British Isles, Mary Queen of Scots, had recently been widowed and returned to her homeland. The big question in England was which queen would marry first, and would they use their husband as an excuse to wage war on the other. Elizabeth wondered this too, and thought if she chose a husband for her cousin, that might bring peace, which she eagerly wished to promote. Wars were expensive things after all. She decided that Robert Dudley would make an ideal match for Mary, and gave him the title of Earl of Leicester before sending him up to Scotland. The plan fell through, and Mary married her cousin Lord Darnley instead. Robert came back to England empty-handed, but Elizabeth was hardly disappointed to have her favourite return to her. The next decade or so at the English court passed in a steady routine for Robert. He was rarely seen out of Elizabeth's presence, and stayed in apartments at court next to hers. Nonetheless, there was still hope that the Queen would consent to a foreign marriage and produce an heir for England. Elizabeth played the long game for many years, teasing the idea of marriage, but always finding an excuse to get out of it. Robert, while he may not have had a physical relationship with Elizabeth, indulged in his fair share of love affairs with other women. With one of his lovers, Douglas Sheffield, contrary to the name she was actually a woman, he sired an illegitimate son, who was born in 1574 and carried his father's name. Robert openly acknowledged his son and educated him just as finely as any legitimate gentleman. Elizabeth probably didn't take this very well, as she was infamous for her jealous nature. In 1565, she openly chastised him for flirting with the Countess of Essex, Lettice Devereux, formerly Lettice Knollys. Lettice was directly related to Elizabeth through her mother's sister, Mary Boleyn. Lettice's own mother may have been an illegitimate daughter of Henry VIII, and her portrait quite closely resembles Elizabeth herself. If this was indeed the case, and Catherine Carey and Elizabeth I were half-siblings, which would technically make Lettice Knollys Elizabeth's niece as well as her cousin, let's just say Robert had a type. The two were rumoured to have become lovers in 1573, when the Earl of Essex, Walter Devereux, was sent to Ireland on military matters. Essex died in 1576, and there were rumours that Robert had poisoned him. It was concluded that the Earl had died of dysentery. In order for any noble to marry, they must first obtain legal consent from their sovereign. It would have been impossible for Robert to ask Elizabeth for permission, given how possessive she was over him, although at that same time she was being courted by the Duc d'Alençon, Francois de Valois, youngest son of Catherine de' Medici. Robert and Lettice were secretly married at Wanstead Hall in September of 1578. They managed to keep it under wraps for 9 months before Elizabeth was told of it. When you watch the dramas, it is often the diplomat promoting Alençon's interest that drops it into conversation. The favour Robert held at court quickly plummeted. Lettice Knollys was shunned by contemporaries. Their way of life was not as luxurious as it used to be. In 1581, Lettice bore Robert a son, who was also named Robert, this time with the title of Lord Denbigh. However, he died aged 3, much to his parents' distress. Robert instead turned to his parental attentions toward his bastard Robert and his 4 stepchildren, one of whom was Robert Devereux, the new Earl of Essex. Aside from his complicated love life, Robert excelled as a courtier and diplomat. He became Chancellor of Oxford University, founding its press, and patronised the talents of Arthur Golding, John Stowe, Nicholas Gilliard, and William Kemp, the latter of whom would become a regular player in Shakespeare's original productions. He, like many in the court, was interested in profiting from this new world, which had held Europe's curiosity for almost a century now. He was one of the financiers behind Sir Francis Drake's expedition, which took him literally around the world. Elizabeth began to accept Robert back into her good graces. Following the assassination of the Protestant William of Orange, she sent Robert to Holland to fend off the Habsburgs. There, he accepted the title of Governor-General of the Netherlands on 1st of January 1586. Elizabeth did not wish for the English troops to attack the Spanish-owned Dutch troops or their territories, but merely defend the Protestants who lived there. The greater Spanish and Dutch forces returned the antagonisation in kind, and Robert was ordered home in defeat. What's worse, he was now in debt after putting much of his own money into funding the war. He arrived home after the Babington plot was revealed, where Elizabeth battled with her own conscience on whether she should execute Mary Queen of Scots, who had been kept prisoner by Elizabeth for almost 20 years, and Robert agreed with the likes of Cecil and Walsingham that England would be safer with the Scottish Queen dead. He and the Privy Council arranged the execution, and he personally was able to avoid Elizabeth's wrath when she found out what they had done. In retaliation, Spain declared war on England and planned to use their mighty Armada to invade. Robert was made Lieutenant and Captain General of the Queen's armies and companies, stationing troops at Tilbury, which was situated towards the mouth of the River Thames. It was the entryway to London, and the likely point of attack for the Armada if they got that far. He insisted it would be a morale booster for the troops to have Elizabeth make an appearance. As she made her famous heart and stomach of a king speech, Robert stood beside her, holding the reins of her horse. Following the defeat of the Armada, Elizabeth once again held Robert close to her heart and person, but it was becoming clear that her favourite's health was beginning to fail. He decided he would travel north to Buxton in Derbyshire and take advantage of its hot springs. However, Robert only made it as far as Oxford, where he died on the 4th of September 1588. Before he passed, he sent a final letter to Elizabeth. "I most humbly beseech your Majesty to pardon your poor old servant to be this bold in sending to know how my gracious lady doth, and what ease of her late pain she finds, being the chiefest thing in the world I do pray for, and for her to have good health and long life. For my own poor case, I continue still your medicine, and find it much better than any other thing that have been given me, thus hoping to find perfect cure at the bath, with a continuance of my most wonted prayer for your Majesty's most happy preservation. I humbly kiss your foot. From your old lodging at Rycote this Thursday morning, ready to take on my journey, by your most faithful and obedient servant, R. Leicester." Robert's death took a heavy toll on Elizabeth. She kept his final letter in a coffer by her bedside for the rest of her life, labelled "His Last Letter," and she locked herself in her room for days before William Cecil decided to break the door down. Robert Dudley was buried in Warwick at the Collegote Church of St Mary, where his ancestor Richard Beauchamp and son by Lettice Knollys were also buried. Lettice Knollys, now twice widowed, married Christopher Blount, while her son Essex succeeded Robert as Elizabeth's favourite. Blount supported Essex's rebellion in 1601, which was soundly defeated. Both would be executed by Elizabeth for treason. Lettice died aged 91 on Christmas Day 1634, and she would be buried next to her second husband. For centuries, the relationship between Elizabeth I and Robert Dudley has always been considered one of the most tumultuous yet tragic love stories to come out of the Tudor era. Due to circumstance of birth, Elizabeth's trauma, and Robert's unfortunate ancestry, marriage would always be out of reach for them. Do I think they were in love? Absolutely. Following the restoration of the monarchy in the 17th century, which gave Parliament more power and less scrutiny on the potential spouse of their monarch, things did get a little easier. Both Mary II and Anne came to the throne already married, but Victoria was unmarried. With less authority, she had to negotiate with Parliament on what her marriage to Prince Albert would look like. He would not be a king, but he was still her choice. Meanwhile, Elizabeth II chose her husband with relative ease, and followed the precedent set by Victoria, although she was also already married when she became queen. Still, that didn't mean all restrictions were off when it came to a monarch or monarch-to-be choosing their spouse. George IV had a secret Catholic wife. Edward VIII abdicated to marry an American Nazi, don't at me. And the less said about Charles and Camilla the better. Let's just say we could have spared one person a lot of stress, depression, and a hell of a lot more if Charles had just been allowed to marry Camilla in the first place. So it's back to Gaetano Donizetti, as I heard it pronounced, the Italian composer and his Tudor operatic cinematic universe. He wrote 4 operas that took place in different parts of the Tudor period, but one constant character in all 4 was Elizabeth I. Anna Bolena, which I talked about first, doesn't have Elizabeth appear per se, but it's about the downfall of her mother, and even the pro shot I tend to use for reference has her younger self linger in the background. Maria Stuarda, Regina di Scozia, which I also talked about, has her as the antagonist, the cruel queen condemning the more virtuous one. There are also 2 lesser-known operas that also take place in Elizabeth's reign. One is set towards the end and centres on the fall of Robert Devereux, and the other is set much earlier on and centres on the love triangle between Elizabeth, Robert Dudley and Amy Robsart. Il Castello di Kenilworth. But this opera also meshes events with Robert's later marriage to Lettice Knollys. Donizetti's operas were written out of chronological order. Kenilworth came first, making Anna Bolena a prequel. Then Maria Stuarda and Roberto Devereux followed in later years. Let me talk about Kenilworth first, and then I'll touch on a bit more about Maria Stuarda, where Robert Dudley also features. The opera takes place at Kenilworth Castle in Warwickshire. Robert is already the Earl of Leicester, and is named so in the libretto. Donizetti wrote the score, while the libretto was written by Andrea Leon Tottola, and it premiered 2 years before Tottola's death in 1831. It was based on Victor Hugo's play Amy Robsart, which itself was based on Walter Scott's novel Kenilworth. Robert Dudley's servants and practically all the court is convinced that Elizabeth plans to marry her favourite. However, what they don't know is that Robert has already secretly married Amy Robsart, and has yet to tell the Queen. Elizabeth pays a visit to the castle, and Robert tries to hide Amy away from the Queen. One of Robert's servants, named Warney, or Varney, wants Amy for himself and tries to manipulate her into forsaking her husband. Amy and Elizabeth meet in the garden, where the truth is revealed. Walter Scott's novel sees Amy murdered by Varney, who then takes his own life in guilt, and it is hushed up by saying Amy just fell down the stairs by accident. The opera, however, doesn't appear to do this. It's an opera with a happy ending. Those are a thing? Well, technically it is bittersweet, because even though Elizabeth loves Robert, he's still got his wife. So Amy Robsart does not die by the end of the opera. You had a golden opportunity for a great tragic ending, and you completely let it slip through your fingers. And yes, my biggest peeve with Maria Stuarda is that Robert Dudley, who famously always loved Elizabeth, is simping for the wrong queen. He has spent years trying to convince Elizabeth to release Mary so he can marry her. I guess Amy died of off-stage disease, and Elizabeth spites him by making him bear witness to her execution. It seems that Donizetti wants Robert to be a tragic hero of some sort, but historical fact is meddling with the common tropes of the opera medium and the outside forces surrounding Donizetti's life. For one thing, Elizabeth was always seen as an antagonistic figure, so anyone who was executed by her is immediately a good guy in their eyes. Anna Bolena is an exception to this rule because Anne Boleyn was seen as a tragic figure at the time who suffered under Henry VIII as much as anyone else. This was before the narrative changed where she was a bit more proactive in the Reformation. Italians in the 19th century have famously struggled with writing operas set in the Tudor era. It's a time rife for tragedy and so many young heroines whose lives were cut short. Why was there never a Catherine Howard opera? I digress. But religious tensions and differing views kept interfering with how the story played out. Donizetti was going to make an opera about Lady Jane Grey, but that also fell through. Luckily he did, because I already established Lady Jane Grey operas are cursed.
Mary will be sure to put in her bed, and then Edward will be all that stands between her and the throne. At best, I will become invisible again. At worst, as long as I am near, you will remain safe. Never fear.
I love you. You know I'm in love with you. I love you. You understand that, don't you? Do you love me?
No.
I don't believe you. You love me.
Robert, the woman who loved you would never do this.
There are several Tudor dramas that show Elizabeth from a young age, but I could only find 2 with Robert Dudley in them. The Tudors features a younger Elizabeth, but her few appearances are in regards to how the other characters feel about her. Robert Dudley, however, never appears, and young Bess completely ignores Robert in favour of Thomas C. Nonce. You heard that right, Thomas C. Nonce. Nonce High Admiral and Baron Sude Nonce. To my ever-loving relief, Robert Dudley was also absent from My Lady Jane. Despite Guilford Dudley's numerous older brothers, they all appear to have been Full Metal Alchemisted into this git named Stan.
Stan, how do you tame a horse in Minecraft?
What?
What is Minecraft and how do you tame a horse in it?
Elizabeth, who could have been replaced with a sock puppet and nothing would have changed, never interacts with him, and he's more interested in shagging Jane's mother, Lady Duckface.
How's Duckface?
Good form, actually, not too mad.
In the Royal Diaries, both the book and the episode of the 3-part miniseries features the young Robert Dudley as Elizabeth's constant companion throughout the events of the last years of Henry VIII's reign. In the adaptation, Robin is played by Daniel Clark. Because Elizabeth and Robin spend a lot of time in the gardens, since in context Elizabeth is trying to restore a patch of roses that her mother once enjoyed, this adaptation feels like a Tudor reenactment of The Secret Garden, with Elizabeth in the role of Mary Lennox and Robert as Dickon Sowerby, and then, to an extent, because Edward is such a frail boy, he's Colin. A deep bond is clearly formed between the two. The book goes into more detail of the two of them growing to accept the fact that they are no longer children, and their innocence died a premature death at the Tudor court. His devotion to Elizabeth is clear this early on, and he's willing to help her, no questions asked. Overall, a clear glimpse into what their future relationship will be like. Becoming Elizabeth is quite similar, as it gives hints as to what Robert and Elizabeth's dynamic will be like, but set later in their adolescence. For a series that's meant to be about Elizabeth, she is one of the least interesting characters in it. I've long since thought that Becoming Elizabeth was a deliberate misnomer because they wanted to make a drama set in the midpoint between Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, but they couldn't get the green light without making Elizabeth the main character. Robert, played by Jamie Blackley, shows up in episode 2 and is already established to be her best friend. He won't hesitate to call her out if she does something wrong, and he won't allow anyone to hurt her. This is why he hates Thomas Seymour so much, and he pretty much voiced my own annoyances with the show for making Elizabeth be so hung up on Thomas, even when Robert shows up with his face covered in bruises, which Thomas gave him. Robert is also the character that the audience follows when his father quashes Ket's rebellion and turns on Seymour, claiming the protectorate for himself. He witnesses a dark element emerge from his father and is visibly terrified of him. Later he is against his father attempting to marry off Elizabeth, but her duty will always take precedence over him. Upset and rejected, he rides back to Norfolk, where Amy Robsart is there for him when no one else is. It's the worst possible timing according to Northumberland, as Edward is now dying and he needs to have Elizabeth on side. But Robert is now married to Amy, and Elizabeth sides with her sister. All these factors add towards Edward and Northumberland choosing Jane Grey for the successor instead of Mary and Elizabeth. There is little resolution to Robert and Elizabeth's arc, as there was hope of a second season which never came. She briefly meets Amy before she is banished from court, but it still serves as a foundation of what's to come, and gives these two a much more realistic depiction of an ongoing connection, which, at the height of their teenage hormone phase, is the most agonising for them, as Robert wants to throw away duty for love, but Elizabeth has already accepted that life is not that simple.
What are you doing here?
My ladies, are you in love?
No, my lord.
Then you should be, or waste all that beauty.
Yes, Donizetti's Robert does count as a disappointment in both cases, but opera is a completely different medium compared with film and television, and I'd use up my word count for this section just talking about those two operas. Instead, we'll talk about my two least favourite depictions outside of Donizetti. I know you're still waiting for me to finish my coverage of Rain. I will, I promise. I just have a lot of things, and the YouTube algorithm doesn't seem to care about Rain that much, so I have to be able to afford to talk about it, okay? Going into season 3, I was really looking forward as to how they were going to portray the Tudor court, as well as Elizabeth and Robert's relationship. And was I disappointed? Yes. Not drastically, but it fell short of what I expected. Charlie Carrick plays Robert Dudley alongside Rachel Scarsden's Elizabeth. From the start of the 3rd season, it's made clear that they have a physical relationship that started back when they were imprisoned in the tower together. Overall, I don't mind if the two are depicted this way, since the question on if they were intimate or not is still up for debate. And let's be honest, this would not be even in the top 100 of crazy liberties that the series took with historical fact. The earlier episodes with Robert, I think, were pretty well done, as it showed Elizabeth's desire to marry for love and gave a reasonable explanation as to what led to Amy Robsart's death. Amy is a little more proactive in trying to stop Robert's infidelity and tries to trick him into staying away from court. However, when Elizabeth gets pregnant, she pressures him to divorce his wife and he locks her up in their house. Out of spite, Amy throws herself to her death so Robert can never marry Elizabeth. Cecil, or someone who closely resembles Cecil but gets kicked out thanks to Lola, drugs Elizabeth so she miscarries. After the midpoint in the season, Robert and Elizabeth's relationship sort of takes a back seat. Robert briefly meets Mary in episode 13. At this time, Mary is still in France, but at least this part of history does get addressed. However, in the last few episodes, Elizabeth spends more time with Lola than she does with Robert. His final scene in the show comes after a failed assassination attempt on Elizabeth, which Lola was involved in, and she faces execution for. Elizabeth now thinks that she can be with Robert if she wants to because the Privy Council is showing her sympathy. She can get anything she wants from them. However, Robert tells Elizabeth that he's already married Lettice Knollys, played by Dame not appearing in this show, and she banishes him from court, never to be seen again. I thought Robert would return in season 4, but instead the fictional Gideon Blackburn takes the place of Elizabeth's love interest. Gideon is not a bad character, but I really wish that this had been Robert, because it would have complemented Mary's own story of love and loss with Francois. Besides, I think that was like 3rd to last episode and the show was getting cancelled anyway. So if you did kill Robert Dudley off then, and that leads her towards victory. In a way, I am actually quite sad that Rain got cancelled because so many subplots did not get finished. But this was nothing compared with Joseph Fiennes in Elizabeth 1998. I'll be honest, I never really liked this movie. Even when I was somewhat lenient towards the other Boleyn girl, I could never get into the first Elizabeth film. I much prefer the Golden Age, because the first movie was very dark, literally and figuratively. and I think it plays more fast and loose with the chronology of events than Golden Age by trying to smush too many events in Elizabeth's reign together. And yes, I'm aware of the irony that in 1998 2 movies came out which both starred Joseph Fiennes and Geoffrey Rush and featured Elizabeth I. But didn't you know? That was part of the settlement when he and his brother Ralph went into acting. Joseph Fiennes gets all the Tudor movies, and Ralph Fiennes gets all the World War II movies. And ne'er the twain shall meet. Unless Joseph Fiennes has been in a World War II movie, in which case I'll shut up. I have a feeling that the Hollywood need, especially in the 1990s, for sex and violence to make history more appeasing to general audiences, played heavily into the depiction of Robert and Elizabeth's relationship. It's very clear early on that these two have been lovers for a very long time, and neither puts any effort into concealing their feelings. Honestly, in historical record the two were very affectionate, but Elizabeth did take great care in demonstrating that she and Robert were never seen completely alone together. They were always being watched, but their displays of affection are a little too public in the movie, especially since her ladies-in-waiting actually watch them in the act. And Elizabeth completely ignores Anjou in favour of Robin. Oh, should I get into how they completely tangled up the French royal family in this? I don't know when I'm going to get another opportunity. I think they got the wrong Anjou. When Elizabeth was proposed marriage to Francois/Hercule de Valois, he was the Duc d'Alençon, and he only became the Duc d'Anjou when Henri III became King of France. He was Anjou when he went to England. The film has him confused with the Anjou who would become Henri III, who was rumoured to cross-dress and take male lovers. But at least Vincent Cassel had fun. They also mix up Robert Dudley's marriages, so it's revealed that he was married all along, although his wife is never named and never appears. Furious at Elizabeth's rejection, he is convinced by the Spanish ambassador to betray Elizabeth, and I think this the most cardinal sin of all. No pun intended. Robert may have taken lovers and married other women, but I believe he never would have betrayed Elizabeth for the benefit of foreign powers. It's so out of character that I have no choice but to call Joseph Fiennes the worst Robert Dudley depicted on screen, no matter the quality of his acting.
You must have a policy of your own, my lord. Is it to marry or to burn?
Oh, I burn.
What would the Queen say if she saw her eyes upon another?
Nothing. Because she will not know, will she?
Robin!
From a friend, lest you make too much of it.
Fondness exceeds propriety. I will not be made to look like a concubine before my own court. You go too far, Robbie.
Bess, wait! Your Majesty!
So, we have each other still, then?
We have each other always, Robin, since that way our affections tend.
Time has worn away the promises we made to each other once.
This category is for what I think are the best portrayals of the Robin-Elizabeth relationship, and the best Robin portrayals overall. 2 of these depictions portray the relationship over a long stretch of time, while the other depends on the chemistry between the 2 actors to fully establish how strong their bond is. Let's start with my personal favourite depiction of Robert Dudley. Elizabeth R, along with the rest of the BBC 1970s Tudor dramas, has a lot of my favourite depictions of these figures. Robert Hardy strides into the 2nd episode of Elizabeth R in a perfect demonstration of what his presence means for both Elizabeth and how her reign will play out. It does surprise me that he was only in half the episodes, but you can make reasonable excuses for his absence. In episode 1 you can say he's still imprisoned by Mary, though he and Elizabeth could have shared at least one scene together. In episode 4, though they never voice it, one can reasonably assume that he is in Holland. And in episode 6, of course, he's dead. Hardy and Glenda Jackson carry a tremendous amount of charisma and chemistry between them that sometimes it really does feel as though you're watching the real Robert Dudley and Elizabeth Tudor interacting. I also wonder how much of their body language was improvised. On his own, Robin leads an influential presence. He has the Dudley charm and cunning, which one can safely assume was trained into him through his own upbringing and fight for survival. When his death comes at the end of episode 5, the audience has grown so used to Robin's presence that one feels its impact almost as much as Elizabeth does. It also sets up the inevitable fallout of Elizabeth's relationship with the Earl of Essex, as he unintentionally reminds her about Letty's Knollys, and she is overwhelmed with regret, taking it out on Essex. No matter how charming the young Earl is, he will never be her true Robin. Next up is another Hardy, Tom Hardy, from The Virgin Queen. It is baffling to see how little this guy has aged since 2005. I think this was one of his first major roles in his early career. Post-Star Trek Nemesis, but pre-Wuthering Heights. And pre-Christopher Nolan! The time frame for their relationship is very similar to Elizabeth R, although Tom's Robin is introduced early on while Elizabeth is still in the Tower, and the two are not reunited properly until after she has become Queen. The Virgin Queen puts a lot more focus on the sexual tension and temptation between the two. Robin's affections towards Elizabeth are much more touchy-feely than they were previously, making Elizabeth's dilemma between duty and love much more difficult. Amy Robsart's death, while a major focus in both shows, has differing depictions. Elizabeth R keeps her death a mystery, but it does put a lot of blame onto Robin for neglecting his wife. Meanwhile, the Virgin Queen has Amy slowly disassociate herself as Elizabeth becomes more tempted by Robert, and he spends less and less time with Amy. After waiting too long for him, and clearly suffering physically and emotionally, she takes her own life. Unlike in Reign, it appears to have been done to stop her own suffering than out of spite. Ultimately, it is Elizabeth's resolution to not give in to Robert that pushes him towards Lettice, and even implies that they became lovers much sooner than historically believed, and thus Robert Devereux is hinted to actually be Robin and Lettice's secret son, which is why Elizabeth feels drawn to him and is pretty much using Essex as a stand-in for Robert. And again, that's her big mistake, because he will never be the Robin she knows so well. The first half of Elizabeth I, the Channel 4 miniseries, shows the later years of Elizabeth and Robert's relationship. Jeremy Irons' Robert Dudley and Helen Mirren have that similar on-screen chemistry as Robert Hardy and Glenda Jackson, where they move and speak together as if they've always been friends for literal decades. Robin knows Elizabeth well enough to predict how her mind works when signing Mary Stuart's death warrant, and being the one to both witness the execution and recall the events to her, because it will sound easier coming from Robin than it would be from Cecil or Walsingham. The latter two always speak to Elizabeth with a detached, professional and pragmatic demeanour, while Robin has that emotional bond with her that makes bad news sound less awful from him. Such is Elizabeth's devotion to him that when the Babington plot is revealed, she fears for her life so much that she needs Robin to come back from Holland for emotional support. She isn't even mad that his Dutch campaign failed so miserably, she just wants him close by. Like Elizabeth R, the first half also sets up Elizabeth's upcoming relationship with the young Essex. With no father, Essex emulates Robin closely, and it's clear that Robin, after losing the son he had with Lettice, has now dedicated his fatherly instincts onto the young Earl, and does his best to be his mentor. Sadly, Essex will mistake Elizabeth's favour as a free pass to do whatever he wants. Meanwhile, Robin genuinely loved Elizabeth for herself, not for what she could give him. All three series show the relationship as platonic. Well, as platonic as you can get without them actually shagging. They may share some kisses or caresses. Elizabeth is perfectly comfortable being mostly undressed around him or having him in her chambers, but they will never cross that final boundary. It establishes that their love is far more emotional than physical. In some cases, Elizabeth may even fantasize about going all the way with him, but she remains, above all, the Virgin Queen.
If you would have me constantly at your side, then marry me, my love.
In this land there will be but one mistress and no master. You are a commoner whose head itches for a crown. Attend to your common business, horsemaster. Keep the Scottish Queen's horses well. It may suit me to return them one day. The Scottish Queen. There's a pretty widow for an ambitious lord.
Your Grace?
I said, Robin, you shall dine with me tonight. And we will keep each other loving company until the morning light.
Do not ask this of me.
If you wed her, she is ours.
And what of us?
What us? Marry the beautiful Queen of Scots. You two become a prince.
If I am noble enough for one queen, I am noble enough for another.
Queen Elizabeth has a great day every day. Robert Dudley only has a great day if Elizabeth looks at him. Such is the case for these two Robins. In the same year, Robert Hardy played alongside Glenda Jackson in Elizabeth R. Daniel Massey was his counterpart in Mary Queen of Scots. This Robert is present in almost every scene with Elizabeth, displaying both the parallels and disparities between the two queens when it comes to matters of love. Both queens are introduced spending time with the man they love while on the river, only to be interrupted by forces out of their control. For Mary, it's Francois's illness, but for Elizabeth, it's Amy Robsart's death. Unlike Mary, who is desperately attached to Francois and prioritises her love for him above all, Elizabeth is practical and sends Dudley away from her side. Though it's clear she cares for Robert, Elizabeth isn't above using him as a pawn in her game against Mary. Her plan is to intentionally send Robert Dudley to Scotland as a potential suitor, while Lord Darnley rides on ahead with a separate diplomatic order to return Mary's horses. Elizabeth wagers with Cecil that Mary will choose Darnley, a spineless, conceited man, over Dudley just to spite Elizabeth. To which she is correct.
If she chooses Dudley, then we are safe from foreign Catholic princes. Though I admit, it will be a hard price for me to pay. If she takes Darnley, we have given nothing, and she has a weak, degenerate fool as her consort. Win or lose the wager, I cannot lose the game.
Though she can't help but be jealous by hearing Robin say that Mary is beautiful. What's more, Robert never relinquishes his keenness to marry Elizabeth, and his constant pursuit of it is what keeps her grounded, much to Cecil's relief. He does have some similarity to Darnley in that fashion, and it's her ability to see that flaw in him that stops him from going in the same direction. The other movie about Mary Queen of Scots has Robert played by Joe Alwyn. Oh, he was dating Taylor Swift when this movie was made. There are so many jokes I can make about it, if YouTube will let me. Much like the 1971 movie, Robert serves as Elizabeth's constant companion, but the events surrounding his dead wife are cut out. At one point she flies into a jealous rage when Mary, thinking Elizabeth will die from smallpox, agrees to marry Robert if she is named heir. Afterwards Robert, though still present throughout the events in England, sort of fades into the background as more attention is given to Mary. Fair enough, it's her movie. His and Elizabeth's relationship sometimes has parallels with Mary and her own pursuit of love, but it doesn't feel as fully developed as the 1971 movie.
Words will not come. Hear that? She is the Queen. The greatest joy of my lifetime has been to serve her. And so will you find it.
I want the world you promised me. And I don't want to dream of a brat crying as I dreamt last night. I was once a brat crying because of the headsman's axe.
Long live Elizabeth. God save the Queen.
Lord Dudley.
May your Yuletide merriments know no bounds, Your Majesty.
The earliest on-screen depiction of Robert Dudley was in 1937, in the film Fire Over England. This was quite a significant film, as it sparked, pun intended, the relationship between Sir Laurence Olivier and Vivien Leigh, and it also convinced David O. Selznick that Vivien Leigh was the perfect fit for Scarlett O'Hara. You know, I really wish I could stop talking about Gone with the Wind, but every time I come to an old movie I have to talk about how the production of Gone with the Wind somehow impacted all the other movies that were made at that time. Robert was played by Leslie Banks. Both Robin and Cecil are portrayed as two integral pillars which keep Elizabeth safe on her throne. Cecil is rapidly declining in health, and Robert keeps him upright. Cecil, however, wants to keep the peace at all costs, while Robert supports the Francis Drake and his antagonising of the Spanish. Robert also takes on the role of Walsingham as he hunts out spies at the court. It is his failure to capture the Spanish spy at court that has him and Cecil team up to send Olivier's Michael Ingleby to Spain in disguise.
So at last they are to marry.
I allow it. They shall not stay at court. I'll have no married folk at my court.
Yet I'm a married man.
Or fool you.
In The Virgin Queen, not to be confused with the 2005 series that came out 50 years later, Robert was played by Herbert Marshall. This movie has more in common with The Golden Age, where the central story surrounds the rise of Sir Walter Raleigh at the English court. albeit just as exaggerated as the Golden Age. Robert Dudley is a supporting character, but he is the catalyst for the film's plot, when his carriage gets stuck in the mud, and Raleigh leads the recovery team. Recognising him, Dudley invites Raleigh to court. He is presented as a humble but wise confidant to Elizabeth. He can predict her motives and recognise the softer part of her underneath her Gloriana facade. It is clear that these two have a history together, and he was just as virile and passionate as Raleigh is now. While Christopher Hatton uses Elizabeth's wrathful temper to his advantage, Dudley always speaks to her human side. One thing I like about this movie is how the people speak. It's very poetic, almost Shakespearean, but it's quite easy to understand what they're saying, thanks to the performances. It's also nice and colourful, which I very much appreciate in Tudor dramas.
I must go on with the business of state.
And finally, Horrible Histories has 2 sketches featuring Robert Dudley. The first sketch demonstrates through body language the relationship between Cecil, Elizabeth and Dudley. Robert comes to court at Christmas to give Elizabeth the very first wristwatch. Cecil is visibly bitter at the favour which Elizabeth gives Robert, who is clearly portrayed as a sycophant. However, as Elizabeth goes to check the time, this happens.
Oh, why it is... Oh dear Lord Dudley.
The second sketch comes much later, which summarises Elizabeth's love life. Robert appears on a ye-old FaceTime with Elizabeth as she's looking for a suitor. His wife has just died, but he built a nice new garden for her at Kenilworth Castle. Elizabeth asks him to move it over a few metres before she finds out that he has married Lettice Knollys, because he changed his social media status.
Lettice Knollys? Ugh, what on earth would have led Robert to develop a taste for lettuce?
In Series 1, Farnaby was seen playing Walter Raleigh, but for the purposes of this sketch, Raleigh is played by Matthew Bainton.
Yeah, she's really lost it.
I'm still here, Cecil.
What I meant was,
Thank you, Anna from Gustine, Annalise Barnett, Jill My Nero, Larissa and Leslie Williams.